elements necessary for this to count as your annual refresher is a review of the 10 and 18. Hey, listen up! Tim Craig has done that for us a couple years running. He's found ways to kind of approach it in a way that is not just reading from the IRPG yet again, putting everybody to sleep. So we leaned on him again this year and he agreed, so all yours, Tim.
This year I'm reading from the IRPG and putting everyone to sleep.
That's how you get out of next year, right?
Yeah, well, I've run out of material. So, how many of you here have heard of Custer's Last Stand? Oh, you're supposed to get a laugh. I did that last year. Come on.
I was getting worried there for a second.
You're running out of material. So, how was General Custer's LCES? Not so good. Anyway, I used to tell the MAC group meetings, and everyone was real serious, that this was the entertainment part of the presentation. So I like to carry on with that and make it a little entertaining anyway. You know, Steve kind of touched on some of where I was leading into this earlier by talking about the Western Fire model. You know, back in the old days, and I've been doing this 32 years now, basically all the fire training was oriented around the Northern Rockies and maybe a little bit in the Deep South somewhere. And like, you know, fire didn't exist anywhere else. And that's changed over the years, and I'm glad to see that being built into, you know, the training, the formal training, and then things like this where, you know, we get to talk about things that are more local. But all of this training, what I tell people all the time, and I've preached for years, is, you know, you need to do the instruction to the audience, not necessarily to the material. So you all have to be able to relate to what we're talking about. It has to have some kind of context that you can understand, and that's why, you know, I talked about Custer's Last Stand, because everybody knows about that. And you can make that connection to some of the elements of firefighting. As some of you recall, last year we had a little bit of a stretch getting the 10 and 18 into that. So we're not doing Custer's Last Stand. I did make some preparation. Of course, I forgot my glasses and I can't read what I wrote. So that'll be a challenge. But one of the things we always joke about when we do the 10 standard fire orders, which is what the 10 is, and the 18 watch out situations, which is what the 18 are, is that nobody can remember the things, right? No one can remember. And everyone's like pulling out their IRPG. Oh yeah, I know what number 6 is. My contention is we do know them. We just don't necessarily have the ability to rattle off the list of them, like I have in front of me, because I can't rattle off the list of them. But how many of y'all have been on a prescribed fire briefing or a wildfire briefing? Pretty much everybody, right? What do we cover in those briefings? Weather. Keep informed of fire weather conditions and forecasts. Standard fire order number 1. What else do we cover in briefings? Communications. Standard fire order number 7. Maintain prompt communications. What else? Yeah. What else?
Medical contingency.
Medical doesn't really fall into this necessarily, but you can make the stretch, sure. I'm sorry? Fuel, which I would contend that we don't do as good a job addressing particularly in our prescribed fire briefings as we probably should. Well, plan, sure. I cannot read this. Well, getting back to the fuel thing for just a second that Steve brought up. How many of that, David, thank you, rescues me again. I think we did this last year.
I was looking for mine, but I don't have my glasses on, so I can't find it. Let's all go stick together.
So, fire order number 2, which is kind of the fuel thing, know what your fire is doing at all times, kind of falls into the fuel thing. How many times in your prescribed fire briefings does fire behavior, expected fire behavior, get addressed? Not that much, really. Now, the problem I see with that is, which I think we need to do a better job of, and this is kind of an aside, but if I'm out dragging a drip torch and I've got 10-foot flames blowing up behind me, and I haven't been told that's good, bad, or indifferent, I'm going to assume that's what the burn boss wanted. So I think a little bit more emphasis being put on, you know, what y'all expect to see when you're out there on the fire, and what is acceptable and unacceptable might be something we add to these briefings. Just, again, that's just as an aside. What else do we talk about in the briefings?
Safety zones.
Safety zones, escape routes that Steve talked about, the lookouts. You know, that's all part of the standard fire orders. How about assignments? You're given assignments. Where does that fall out in the standard fire orders? Sure, a whole bunch of them. Give clear instructions and be sure they're understood. That's the briefing in itself. But it also goes down to the chain of command, which is your assignments, which is maintain control of your forces at all times. Fire order number 9. 5 is post lookouts. 4 is identify escape routes and safety zones and make them known. 3 goes back to the fuel and the fire behavior thing. Base all actions on current and expected behavior of the fire. The last one, which everyone knows, is fight fire aggressively, having provided for safety first. I mean, that should be the lead-in to the briefing in general. You know, I think that the standard fire orders are kind of like putting on your Nomex. That's the attitude that you should be going into your operational period with. You know, that's your basis of operations, is those fire orders. Now, the lookout situations, the 18 lookouts that are mentioned here, the watchout situations, you know, they're more specific, but we also do specific lookouts as part of our briefings, right? This part of the line is not vehicle accessible or UTV accessible. There's a mud hole down here. There's a snag over here. You know, all those are watchout situations that routinely come up in our prescribed fire briefings, or wildfire briefings, as it were. So we're covering these specific things, just maybe not specific to this, because, you know, again, as we talked about earlier, you know, in the coastal plain, there's no topographical relief to speak of, so things like, you know, on a hillside where rolling material can ignite fuel below, or, you know, things, terrain and fuels, building a fire line downhill with fire below. Things like that don't necessarily apply everywhere, but there are things that probably aren't on this list that we do cover on a fairly routine basis. You know, don't walk through a big patch of greenbrier. What happens if you're doing that and your drip torch gets hung up, or your tool gets hung up? You know, those are watch-out situations that aren't necessarily part of this, but are still, you know, applicable to what we're doing in this part of the world. Let me very quickly, so I can say I did it, run through these, and then we'll move on to something perhaps more interesting. Number 1, fire not scattered and sized up. You're in country not seen in daylight. Safety zones and escape routes not identified. Well, that goes back to the previous discussions. You're unfamiliar with weather and local factors influencing fire behavior. We have a W-Trex coming up this spring, which theoretically, if y'all are familiar with that, but it's basically a prescribed fire workshop that can bring people in from different parts of the country into this part of the world for a 3-week fire assignment. Theoretically, some of those people aren't familiar with weather and local conditions, that's a watch-out situation for them. They need to be briefed on that when they get here. You're uninformed on strategy, tactics, and hazards. Your instructions and assignments are not clear. And again, this goes back to that briefing that we always do. Make sure those assignments are clear and everyone understands them. No communication link with crew members or supervisor. Constructing line without a safe anchor point. You're building fire line downhill with fire below. You're attempting a frontal assault on a fire. You have unburned fuel between you and the fire. You cannot see the main fire or not in contact with someone who can. You're on a hillside where rolling material can ignite fuel below. Your weather is becoming hotter and drier. Wind increases and or changes directions. You're getting frequent spot fires across your line. Terrain and fuels make escape to safety zones difficult. And always, last but not least, taking a nap by the fire line. So those are our standard fire orders and our watch-out situations. One of the things we talk about in these discussions frequently is common denominators on tragedy fires or fatality fires, right? That's where most of these watch-out situations came from to begin with. One of the other kind of common denominators with those fires is what? A lot of them happen to really experienced firefighters, right? Hotshots, smoke jumpers. Did those guys and girls not learn standard fire orders and watch-out situations? I mean, at the very least, everybody is hearing at least once a year in one of these trainings. So they learned it, right? Did they forget it? Maybe. Did they ignore it? Did they ignore some of these? Possible. Or more likely, did they recognize some of these things and just not react to it or take the appropriate action? I think that's probably more the case in a lot of these than not. And why is that? I was going to show a video. Some of you probably noticed this year I bought myself a toy. I bought a GoPro. And I've been wearing this around on our burns, at least when I remember. And I got to tell you, a lot of the stuff we do is pretty damn boring. I got a lot of video of just nothing. But every now and then, something happens that I capture. And one of the things I got last year, we were on a burn on DCR property, and some of you, the workers in the back room, a lot of you were all on this burn. We had like a 2.5 acre slop-over. And I basically captured the entire day on the helmet cam. And I edited some of it down. Was going to show it, but we don't have time. I may post it online, actually, so that folks can go look at it. I didn't think it was going to show up very well. And the audio is fairly important, and I didn't think that was going to show up at all. So what I would describe, and this is strictly from my perspective, this is me. This is my self-evaluation in relation to some of this stuff. It was not a particularly flattering picture of me on this particular burn. And here's why. Because we were doing this burn, and the first half of it was down into a drainage. It was closed canopy. There wasn't a lot of fire behavior. The last half of it, the canopy opened up, different fuel type, more exposure, different fire behavior, right? We were burning this with an east wind forecast. We had a highway on the public road on one side, so Yeah. So the east wind was going to push the fire away from the highway. We had sand roads on two sides of it, a highway and a drainage. So, you know, with an east wind, should have drawn. Steve Huckner PowerPoint. Right. Sir? Oh, I need to be able to draw on first.
They can watch you
All right. So we have a public roadway, we have drainage, we have sand road coming around this way, another sand road going that way. And this is our burn unit. And the first half of it, closed canopy, second half of it, wide open. That's north. We have an east wind forecast, right? So we burn down here along the sand road, and what we don't want to burn is down here. Well, what the video will show, if I were to show it, was that I was back checking the line back here. I walk up the road, fire's engaged in here, we're burning out this part of the unit, and everyone's queued up along the road here because east wind, we're holding this line. And you can see on the video, as I walk up and see the fire in here, my head going, fire, sand road, fire, sand road. At that moment, I knew something was going to go sideways. I didn't say anything. Or what I said was these very passive statements like, maybe we ought to go pull fire up here. Hey, the wind's starting to shift this way, which it was. We started to get a north. I didn't, you know, my communication, which is recorded on here, was that, you know, hey, you know, kind of the fire's doing this. Hey, what do you think about doing this? Very, you know, very passive. You know, I saw what was happening. I don't know. We're not going to rehash the burn today, but I saw what was happening, and I didn't make definitive statements like, hey, this is what I'm seeing. This is what's going to happen. This is what I think we ought to do. I was not in a leadership position. In a second. But at one point I said, I think I'm going to walk up around the corner here just in case somebody needs some help. And, you know, so I ended up over here. We got a hard north push. Fire spotted over the sand road. Finally, it basically got ahead and ran across the sand road. And we had this slop-over in here where we didn't want it. Wasn't a huge deal, but I had to watch it, you know, 3 or 4 times before I started reflecting on what I was doing. I've been doing this 32 years. I'm reasonably sure to say I'm the most experienced person in this room. I did not respond appropriately to what I was seeing. Why? Why does a hot shot crew get burned over when they know all this and they're looking down at the fire? Why? Anybody? Come on.
Group faith could be part of it.
Sure.
Everybody else says it's okay, I think we're fine. And you let that override what your intuition says.
Sure. That's certainly part of it.
Somebody else can take care of it.
Huh?
Somebody else can take care of it, or somebody else is in charge.
Well, I specifically mentioned I was not in a leadership position, and that
Did they not see it?
I don't know, and it doesn't matter, Rick, because I saw it.
Yeah.
And you can look at being in a leadership position 2 ways, or not being in a leadership position 2 ways. You can say, not my job, somebody else's job. Is that the right answer? No.
See something.
No. You can also look at it like, sort of what Darren was saying is, you know, maybe I'm overreacting to it. Yeah. maybe, Rick's the burn boss, and I'm assuming Rick knows what he's doing. He's recognizing the same thing I'm recognizing. So there's different ways to look at that. You don't feel, if you're not in a leadership position, you don't feel you have the authority to say something or to try and intervene in that way.
So there's hesitancy to speak up and be assertive, and also fear of being wrong, essentially.
Yeah, sure.
Or stepping on toes.
Yeah.
Or fear of slowing down the day's work. I mean, with prescribed fire, we always have, these expectations to get a certain acreage out, so maybe there's a fear of that as well.
Yeah. Is there a certain amount of complacency involved? I mean, not just in this example, but just in general now. As we're talking about, this whole general concept of, when you say something, how you react to things. There's a certain amount of complacency that gets built into what we're doing. Fatigue, I think that has an awful lot to do with, maybe not with what we're doing on a daily basis, but, weeks on end on a fire assignment somewhere, or you're rolling assignment after assignment, and sometimes you just get so tired that you see something and you just it doesn't process. And I've been there before. Influence of others, am I overreacting kind of thing that Darren mentioned. You're just simply your personality, you're just not strong enough in your impressions, or your expression. I use the example that Malcolm Gladwell talks about in this book. You all know I love books. Outliers, about Korean Airlines crash in Guam a number of years ago, where, and this was kind of a cultural thing, but the co-pilot of the plane knew the plane was going to crash, and basically would not tell the pilot, the senior man, hey dumbass, you're going to fly us into a mountain. Literally, the plane crashed. And that was the NTSB findings on it, was simply this cultural thing where the junior man would not, be assertive, is Chris's word, with his senior pilot and tell him, you're screwing up, you're going to kill us all. And he killed them all, damn near all of them. So that's one of the things we need to think about. Using that deferential language. And that's what I was doing. This might not be a good idea kind of thing. Sometimes that's not the best way to approach things. Sometimes you need to say, hey dumbass, you're going to kill us if you don't do something different. And then, one thing is, our judgment of the consequences of the actions. And we do this all the time on prescribed fires. Well, if it gets away, we'll just go back to the next line and burn it out. Well, if it gets away, it won't be that big a deal. We make these judgments of, what's going to happen if something goes wrong. And, sometimes, if we're just going to go back to the next line and burn it out anyway, why didn't we just do that in the beginning? One of those kind of things. So judging those consequences can be a very dangerous game. Particularly, if I know if this is my judgment and y'all don't know that, have the same information to make that judgment as I do, you guys can be looking at each other like, what's he doing? Why are we doing it this way? So that's another thing. And then the final thing I'll leave you with is this concept of normalization of error, or normalization of deviancy. These are our fire orders, we don't deviate from them, but we're going to deviate from a couple of them, and that becomes normalized. And then the whole thing starts to erode away. You have to be very careful not to let those kinds of things start to happen to you. Or at some point, you know, it doesn't matter if you know these things, if you've been told these things. If you ignore them, if you don't recognize them, if you don't act on them appropriately, it doesn't matter whether you know them or not. So, I'll be fine.
Just a comment about your recognition of the consequences. I think, we're all here in natural resource management positions, and one of, I think, our first kind of responses, oh yeah, that's not a big deal, it's not gonna do any damage to that unit, we're on another unit. You know, that may be the first thing that we think about, but we have to take that step. We're delaying, we're keeping people another, whatever, 2 hours, 2.5 hours to do that, secure a unit. And then we often have people driving 2 hours. Then they're pushed to much later in the evening, much more fatigued. Those are the consequences that we have to be looking at.
Sure. So, anybody else? I kind of got off on a rant there. My intention was to make this more of a discussion, but.
Well, I was on that fire we discussed, and one thing I noticed from the very beginning was our transport winds were from the north. Now, I know that in southeast Virginia, east wind is not reliable, and that the transport winds can affect what happened on the ground. So while our surface level winds were going east, what we were burning with, the upper level winds were from the north. And I kept looking at that, and I kept looking at it, but I ignored it because we were still in the east wind. Until we didn't.
Yeah, and it's a lesson learned. You know, we haven't really talked about lessons learned this morning, which we usually throw that in somewhere. You know, it's a big lesson learned for me. Is, you know, not to shirk off my responsibility, and I would say all of us have the same responsibility, whether you're assigned that responsibility or not. You know, we always talk about being your own lookout and you're responsible for your own safety and all that happy stuff. Well, it counts here too. Richard?
I think a lot of it too, I look at kind of the opposite of what you're talking about, is where my inexperience, you know, caused me to not say something.
Yeah.
I remember a couple of years ago, you and I were on a run, and I get around the corner and I witnessed the gates of hell and it's blowing up and it looked terrible, and you shut and go, that's not. But you were right, it flashed up and it all settled right back down, and it was not understanding the complexity of the tool, but I'm so glad you said something, and then I got something to learn out of it too. So, the other side of that is say something even when you're not gonna make a fool of yourself if you say you think it's gonna be this and it's not doing it.
I mean, we tend to be really good, you know, after things go sideways. You know, when the shit hits the fan, we tend to be really good, and that's the other half of, you know, this helmet cam video. And you know what I focused on was that lead up, you know, where I didn't do the things that I know I should have been doing. The other half of it is after it blew out the line, and then we had to kind of reconfigure and go catch the fire. You know, that was great. Everyone, you know, and you can hear me, and I won't, you know, again, this just picks up me for the most part. You know, my entire demeanor changed. I'm giving commands. I'm telling people, do this, do that. It's no longer, why don't we do this? Now that's on me, 100%. That's a self-evaluation, and I would suggest that everybody in this room needs to do that from time to time.
And be honest about it.
Yeah.